On the morning of December the 13th, 2024, the conference room at Sutter County Title was quiet enough to hear the copier in the hallway, and the folder in front of Roy Caldwell held one date that had followed him for 5 years. December 15th, 2024, balloon maturity on a private seller note, principal due in one shot, $310,000. Elaine Sutter sat across from him with a legal pad, the same lender who had renewed his operating line every spring, cautious, exact, never sentimental, with numbers. She expected a refinance packet because that was what nearly everyone brought in during a balloon year, and she had even printed draft terms the night before. 7.1% fixed, 15-year amortization, land as collateral, standard pressure release for a borrower who needed time. Roy did not ask for her draft. He placed a cashier check on top of the folder, payable for $310,000, with the memo line reading payoff of seller note, Caldwell 140 adjoining tract, and then he slid the original note across the table so the payoff could be marked and recorded before the deadline hit. Elaine looked at the check, then at Roy, then back at the check, and her pen stopped moving. She had watched this county through every cycle. Late 1990s optimism, 2008, credit freeze, input spikes, drought years, soft years, and she had seen plenty of good operators cornered by one due date they could not outgrow. Roy was not cornered. He was closing. Mitch Harlan, from the John Deere dealership, happened to be in the front office that same hour, dropping off floor plan inventory paperwork, and he glanced through the glass as Roy signed the final release. Mitch recognized the old canvas coat, same one he had seen in April when Roy asked about transmission service and got laughed out of urgency, and he recognized the name on the closing packet when the clerk called it out. Caldwell? Paid in full? No carryover lien? No speech followed, no correction, no victory lap. Roy put the stamped release in a manila envelope, shook Elaine's hand once, and walked back to a pickup with rust along the wheel arches and an odometer that had crossed 300,000 miles months earlier. By noon that day, he owned 660 acres, free and clear, and every acre was still in his name, because an old 1968 Oliver, declared finished in spring, had put seed in the ground inside the last planting window. To understand why that check existed and why he never explained himself when people guessed wrong, the story has to go back to a different room, a different ledger, and one afternoon in 1987 when Roy was 29 and learned what debt sounds like when it gets sold by the piece. The foreclosure auction was held behind Roy's uncle Wesley Caldwell's machine shed on August 22, 1987, and the sound Roy remembered was the auctioneer calling bids too fast for the shame on Wesley's face to keep up. A 6-row planter that had cost $18,000 3 years earlier sold for $6,400. A grain truck went for less than its recent tire bill. Nobody in that crowd thought Wesley was careless. He had borrowed during strong years, rain failed twice, corn sank, and the note got bigger while the crop got smaller. Roy stood beside Nora, who was still his fiancée then, and watched a life reduced into line items. He did not come home swearing off risk in general. He came home with one specific decision. He would borrow for seasonal operating costs when biology required cash up front, and he would avoid long-term machinery debt whenever he had another option, because the year that breaks a note never asks permission first. Roy and Nora married in 1988, rented 80 acres at first, and she took over records in a way that made every dollar answer a question before it left the account. She used ruled ledgers until 2006, then moved the same discipline into spreadsheets, and nothing entered those books as a rough guess. Their household spending stayed plain by design, one vacation in 15 years, no truck payment, and repairs done before replacements were discussed. The first real test came in 1996 when a 60-acre parcel near their rented ground came up private sale at $54,000. Bank financing was available, friendly terms, and several neighbors said to keep cash liquid and let cheap debt work. Roy and Nora had saved $58,000 by then, enough to pay outright and still hold $4,000 in reserve. Paying cash meant a thinner cushion for one season, and it also meant no lien that could be called if a crop failed. They wrote the check. That purchase created the next obstacle almost immediately. They now owned dirt and needed equipment reliable enough to farm it, plus their rented acres, and dealership financing came with clean paint and monthly certainty. Roy chose a different path because the math pushed him there. In 1997, he bought a used International 1466 for $14,500 and spent 19 winter evenings replacing hydraulic lines with Earl Dugan, a retired mechanic who treated machinery like a series of solvable arguments. The repaired tractor held through spring, which preserved cash, which made the next land chance possible. In 1999, Roy and Nora bought 80 acres from the Lindstrom estate for $88,000 cash after a short bidding round where finance buyers needed 30 days and the estate wanted 10. That speed discount mattered. Nora logged it in the margin as value of liquidity, and the note in her ledger stayed there for years because it explained future choices better than any slogan ever could. 3 seasons of average yields followed, never dramatic, just enough margin each year to move one line item from maybe later into done now. In 2003, they bought 120 acres for $168,000 from a retiring couple who preferred direct sale over listing. Roy drove home that evening in silence because the number was heavy, and Nora set coffee on the table, opened the ledger, and showed him the remaining cash after closing and input prepay. They were thinner than comfortable and still solvent without new debt. Land prices accelerated in the mid-2000s, which made restraint harder because everyone around them looked richer on paper each quarter. In 2004, Mitch Harlan started as a salesman at the Deere store and learned quickly that appearance sold equipment, clean cabs, polished fenders, financing folded into seasonal payment promises. Roy kept showing up in older iron, buying parts, paying same day, rarely chatting. Mitch read that as inability, and Roy never corrected him. The next acquisition arrived in 2008, 100 acres for $245,000 during a period when credit tightened and several approved buyers lost financing at closing. Roy and Nora could close because their money was already in the account. They signed, transferred funds, and came back to a stack of messages asking why they were still running equipment from the 1970s if they had just bought more land. They did not answer any of those messages. By 2010, their operation had shape, steady corn and soybean rotation, disciplined maintenance, conservative input buys, and an operating line used for seed and fertilizer timing, then paid down after harvest. Elaine Sutter noticed what many did not. Roy requested less than peers with similar acreage, and his line moved predictably. Risk did not disappear from weather or markets, yet his fixed obligations stayed low enough that a bad month did not automatically become a bad decade. Another parcel came in 2013, 90 acres at $324,000. Price per acre higher than anything they had paid before. Nora challenged the deal first, not from fear, from arithmetic, and they ran 3 scenarios at the kitchen table: average yields, weak prices, 1 weather hit. The purchase survived each scenario if they delayed 2 equipment upgrades and cut household withdrawals. They bought it, then lived that trim plan exactly as written. In 2018, they added 70 acres for $301,000 from a neighbor retiring without heirs nearby. That closed the first long arc. 520 owned acres accumulated from 1996 through 2018, each bought with cash, each recorded with the same small ritual. Nora wrote the legal description, Roy wrote the check number, and they both initialed the page. No one in town called it stealth wealth at that point. Town called it old-fashioned and somewhat stubborn. Roy did carry one long note in his whole career, and it came from a decision that looked aggressive compared with his pattern. In 2019, the adjoining 140 acres finally came available. Contiguous, good drainage, direct access to his existing fields, and the asking price was $560,000. Passing on it meant someone else could split his field edge for a generation. Buying it outright would drain reserves too far. He put down $250,000 and signed a 5-year seller note for $310,000 at 3.9% fixed. Balloon due, December 15th, 2024. That note changed the emotional weather of every decision from that day forward. Interest payments were manageable, roughly $12,090 each year, while principal stayed intact, and the real pressure sat at maturity, because the full $310,000 had to appear on one date. No excuses. Elaine offered refinance options even in 2019, sensible options, yet Roy chose to carry the balloon and build cash toward it, because he wanted the land clear before retirement years narrowed his appetite for uncertainty. In 2021, Roy added one machine that would later become the hinge of the whole story. At a farm sale outside Dugan Ridge, he bought a 1968 Oliver 1850 diesel for $7,800. Faded green paint, straight tin, mechanical injection, and enough wear to scare anyone who wanted plug-in diagnostics and dealership screens. Roy wanted a planting backup that could be fixed with tools and patience. Earl Dugan inspected it, grunted once and said the bones were good if Roy kept up on filters, fuel, and seals. He spent 2 winters bringing that tractor into backup condition, cleaning the tank, replacing worn hoses, rebuilding linkages, and exercising it under load every few weeks so it never sat stale. Mitch saw it once when Roy drove through town and made a joke to a parts counter clerk about museum pieces still paying road tax. Roy bought oil filters and kept walking. Around Roy, other farmers made different decisions that made sense in ordinary years and got punished when timing turned. Tommy Vance expanded hard between 2019 and 2023, adding rented ground until he reached roughly 1,480 acres. He financed a late-model planter and a high-horsepower tractor package with a combined principal near $680,000 at rates that adjusted upward after the first term. When corn sat above $6, he looked right, because every acre covered debt service and left margin. Glenn Pike ran a mixed operation, crops plus cattle, and carried optimism as naturally as some people carry caution. He borrowed to update his feed mixer, then borrowed again to add tiled ground, and by 2023 he had about $420,000 across equipment and land notes. Glenn was not reckless. He was trying to secure scale for his 2 sons, and every advisor he met showed spreadsheets where growth solved pressure. Those spreadsheets assumed normal years arriving on schedule. Roy watched both men with sympathy because he understood the appeal of speed. He had felt it himself every time a dealer offered newer iron with deferred payments and lower fuel burn charts. And he also remembered his uncle's auction, where one bad sequence erased decades of work. His caution did not come from believing he was smarter. It came from believing weather and price swings do not negotiate with monthly obligations. The spring of 2024 opened with tension already built in, balloon deadline 9 months away, principal still $310,000, and zero appetite for a refinancing scramble in December. Roy needed a normal crop year, nothing heroic, just timely planting and competent execution, across 620 cropped acres, 430 in corn, 190 in soybeans, with 40 acres left in alfalfa and grass waterways that supported rotation and soil structure. On April 27th, 2024, his primary planter tractor, a 2012 Deere 7830 he had bought used years earlier, lost transmission drive while pulling out of a field after maintenance checks. The machine moved under its own power only in one range and slipped under load. Roy hauled it to Mitch's dealership before lunch because planting windows do not wait for pride. Mitch checked service backlog and parts availability, looked over the ticket, and told Roy it would likely be 6 weeks, maybe longer. Spring queue was packed and one internal component was on national back order. He then walked Roy toward the lot and pointed at a newer replacement option, used but clean, purchase price $290,000, finance over 7 years at around 7.4%, monthly payment about $4,438, just over $53,000 a year before insurance. Roy asked one practical question. Could the old Oliver pull his planter if he adjusted speed and field schedule? Mitch laughed, looked over Roy's shoulder toward the road where the Oliver sat on Roy's trailer, and said, "That tractor is finished. You are one breakdown away from missing corn." He recommended signing that day. Roy said no, thanked him for the diagnosis time, paid the inspection fee, and hauled both problems home, a disabled main tractor, and a decision that had to be solved in less than 2 weeks. That transmission failure made the cash consequence explicit. Missing the final corn window would cut expected yield enough to threaten the $310,000 balloon payoff and force December refinancing under whatever terms the market offered. That dismissal resolved one hesitation Roy had carried since winter. He had been considering whether to take on one large machinery note to modernize before the balloon came due, and Mitch's timeline made the risk concrete. Roy declined the $290,000 replacement financing and chose the repair path on purpose because hitting planning on existing equipment protected liquidity for the December payoff. The path narrowed on April 27th and forced a clear choice. Roy called Earl Dugan that evening. Earl was retired in name only, still ran a small shop behind his house, still believed mechanical diesels earned respect when people listened to them. He inspected the Oliver the next morning, found wear in the injection pump, and a failing governor spring, plus 2 fuel lines that would not survive sustained field load. Earl quoted $4,200 parts and labor, cash on completion, no promises if hidden damage appeared inside the pump housing. Roy approved it before breakfast. The repair took 7 days of hard shop work and one scavenged component sourced from a salvage yard 2 counties over. Earl's hands shook slightly when he torqued the final bolts, age showing itself in small ways, yet his calibration was exact. On May 5th, they fired the Oliver, adjusted timing by ear and gauge, and ran it on a dyno pull long enough to trust it under load. The invoice came to exactly $4,200, same as quoted. Roy paid in cash. Planning started May 8th on lighter ground and moved nearly non-stop through May 19th with short sleep and careful logistics. Roy ran the Oliver on the planter in 12-hour stretches, while a smaller support tractor handled tender wagons and transport. Nora tracked field completion, by township map and updated seed use each night so resupply did not stall momentum. The final corn acres went in within the county agronomic window, late enough to raise risk, still in time to preserve yield potential. Tommy Vance started later because a precision monitor fault idled his finance planner for 4 days while a technician traveled in from another district. He carried the added cost because service plans on complex systems are expensive and delays compound quickly in spring. Glenn Pike managed to plant on time, yet he entered summer with tighter cash because feed costs ran high and his adjustable loan rate reset upward. Neither man was careless. Both were squeezed by fixed obligations, arriving regardless of field conditions. Rain distribution turned favorable in June and July, enough moisture to support pollination without long saturation. August heat stayed moderate, and Roy's fields held better than expected for their planting dates. Harvest began in early October, and the numbers started answering questions that had been open all year. Corn averaged 181 bushels per acre across 430 acres, totaling 77,830 bushels. Soybeans averaged 54 bushels per acre across 190 acres, totaling 10,260 bushels. Roy sold corn at an average of $4.72 per bushel through staggered contracts and post-harvest cash sales. That yielded roughly $367,358 in corn revenue. Soybeans averaged $11.38 per bushel, adding about $116,759. Combined crop revenue landed near $484,116, and because fixed payments stayed low, the operation converted that year into net farm cash after expenses and tax of $336,000. That net number was the hinge. The balloon principal due on December 15th, 2024 remained $310,000, and Roy now had the liquidity to erase it without refinancing. He and Nora sat at the same kitchen table where they had run worst-case scenarios for decades, and this time the worksheet had one line circled 3 times, cashier check, $310,000, execute before due date. They left $26,000 in net cash from 2024 after payoff and carried separate reserves from prior years untouched. Elaine Sutter reviewed the numbers before closing day and understood what had happened in plain terms. A farmer who looked capital constrained from the road had protected flexibility long enough for one good year to solve a 5-year risk event outright. She marked the seller note release, then offered a renewal on his operating line for 2025 at better terms, rate reduced from 6.75% to 5.6%. Unused line fee waived because his risk profile had improved materially once the land was debt-free. Roy accepted the line, not because he needed leverage for expansion, because seasonal timing still requires working cash in agriculture. The social correction happened without ceremony. Mitch Harlan realized what the April interaction had cost when Roy moved all routine service and most parts purchases to an independent shop after the planting season. Annual business vanished quietly, no complaint filed, no scene at the counter. Mitch heard the numbers through county talk after the December payoff and looked back at his own assumption, old coat, old tractor, must be broke, and he understood the error had been conceptual, reading consumption as solvency. Roy did not pursue any revenge moment, and he did make one deliberate choice with that vindication. He turned it outward into financing terms younger farmers could survive. A public proof became a private lending standard in his own county. Roy did not pursue any revenge moment. Yet one came in public view anyway during a county auction in August 2025. A retiring family sold a 24-acre parcel that sat inside a patchwork of beginning operators who needed contiguous ground to stay efficient. Roy bid cash and won at $192,000, with the purchase funded through a new lending pool he and Nora had seeded at $150,000 earlier that year, plus repayments and partner contributions. Mitch stood near the ring and watched the clerk announce cash settlement within 10 days. The key point in that auction was ownership destination. Roy did not fold the 24 acres into his own 660. Title transferred to a local starter partnership under terms backed by the fund, and Roy kept his personal land position unchanged at 660 acres, all debt-free since December 2024. He had used credibility and cash flow to open a door for someone else, which is what his discipline had always been building toward even when nobody could see it yet. The Beginning Farmer Equipment Fund launched in February 2025 with $150,000 from Roy and Nora. Structured as no-interest equipment notes secured by liens, strict maintenance covenants, and quarterly bookkeeping review with Nora at no fee. Their first two borrowers were Kara Jensen, age 27, and Luis Ortega, age 31, both strong operators shut out by high commercial rates on used machinery packages. Kara received a $68,000 no-interest note over 7 years for a used 12-row planter and nurse trailer. Her annual payment under the fund was $9,714. A bank offer she carried in her folder was near 8% and would have required about $13,058 a year using standard amortization. The difference, $3,344 annually, stayed in her operation as working margin during the years she needed stability most. Luis received $52,000 over 6 years for a grain cart and a reliable older combine head, also no interest. His annual payment under the fund was $8,667. A commercial loan near 8.25% projected roughly $11,320 annually. He kept about $2,653 each year that would have gone to interest, enough to cover crop insurance premiums and part of fertilizer prepay without borrowing more. Those two loans used $120,000 of the $150,000 seed pool, leaving $30,000 as reserve for repairs and contingencies. Repayments recycled back into the fund, which created a modest multiplier effect even in year one. Combined annual payment relief for Kara and Luis was $5,997, and that relief reduced the probability that one weather shock would force either of them into predatory short-term credit. Roy cared about that statistic because he had seen its opposite in 1987. Tommy Vance's arc resolved with hard compromises and dignity intact. Rising rates and too tight seasons pushed his debt service beyond what his acres could comfortably carry. And the same $680,000 leverage package that accelerated his expansion became the fixed burden he had to unwind when margins compressed. So he entered a restructuring in late 2024, sold one finance tractor and a secondary planter, and took a custom planting job with a regional operator in 2025 to rebuild liquidity. Roy hired Tommy for 20 acres of side-by-side trial work that spring, paid promptly, and kept the conversation practical. Tommy was still farming, just in a different shape than he had planned. Glenn Pike reached a parallel conclusion through a different path. Feed volatility and loan resets made ownership math increasingly fragile, and the roughly $420,000 in notes that once looked manageable became the reason he shifted away from owned expansion. So he chose to exit owned ground rather than wait for forced liquidation. He sold his remaining titled acreage under negotiated terms, leased back core fields on a manageable rent structure, and kept his cattle operations smaller and steadier. Roy rented Glen hay equipment at low seasonal rates through Earl's shop network, one quiet neighbor helping another stay in motion. Elaine Sutter's role in the county shifted as she used Roy's case in risk discussions, anonymized when necessary, detailed when permission allowed. Her main point was nuanced and practical. Debt can build capacity in the right conditions, yet fixed obligations that stack too high remove options exactly when options are needed most. She renewed Roy's line in 2025 under better terms because his ledger proved resilience, and she also worked harder to stress test balloon notes for younger borrowers who had never seen a full cycle. Earl Dugan kept his shop door open 3 days a week and became an informal mentor to local mechanics who wanted to understand older systems before those skills disappeared. Roy paid him for the 2024 repair, then hired him again for winter preventive work even after the crisis passed, because reliability in old machines comes from maintenance intervals, not folklore. Earl told younger mechanics the same sentence every spring. If you can diagnose without guessing, you can keep a farm alive one season longer. Mitch Harlan remained at the dealership, still good at moving new inventory, still operating inside a model where financed replacement is often the fastest path for busy operators. His blind spot narrowed after 2024. He stopped reading worn equipment as proof of weakness and started asking better questions before making assumptions: acreage mix, debt load, cash position, repair capability. He never got Roy's business back, and he did gain a different respect for the people walking in with mud on older boots and exact change at the parts desk. Roy and Nora entered late 2025 with their numbers plain and stable: 660 acres owned debt-free, operating line available and lightly used, no long-term machinery payments, and a net worth calculated at $3.84 million, including land, equipment, grain inventory, and cash reserves. The old Oliver still sat in their machine shed, paint no prettier than before, now with a rebuilt injection pump and fresh fuel lines, parked beside newer tools that had been bought only when timing and arithmetic lined up. Their visible life changed less than people expected once the county understood their balance sheet. Same pickup, same house with repaired siding, same winter routine where Nora reconciled books at the kitchen table, and Roy checked service intervals with Earl's notes, clipped to a clipboard. Security showed up in quieter ways: no panic when markets dipped, no scramble when repairs hit, no lender calls dictating how next season had to look. The central reversal that began this story never required an argument at the dealership counter. Mitch said the 1968 Oliver was finished. Roy paid $4,200 to repair it instead of signing $290,000 in replacement financing, planted 430 corn acres and 190 soybean acres inside the window, harvested 181 bushels corn and 54 bushels, soybeans per acre, sold at $4.72 and $11.38, netted $336,000 after expenses and tax, and turned that into a $310,000 cashier check before December 15th, 2024. Every step in that chain caused the next one. The 6-week service delay closed the replacement fantasy. The dismissal pushed him toward repair. The repair preserved planting timing and kept the balloon payoff from collapsing into refinance pressure. Timely planting preserved yield. Yield plus pricing created liquidity. Liquidity retired the balloon. Debt-free land created negotiating power. Negotiating power became lower bank terms and a $150,000 no-interest fund for Kara and Luis. Tommy and Glenn took harder leverage paths and adjusted with dignity when those paths tightened, which made Roy's result clearer without diminishing their effort. Arithmetic carried the argument start to finish, and it did so without requiring Roy to explain himself to anyone. When people in the county mention that spring now, they do not talk about a dramatic confrontation, because there was none. They talk about a narrow window in May, a retired mechanic with steady hands, a wife who kept books tight enough to trust under stress, a lender who recognized improved risk when she saw it, neighbors who adapted with dignity after leverage turned against them, and one old tractor whose usefulness had been mispriced by people who confused age with failure. Roy still drives past the dealership some mornings on his way to fields he owns outright. He does not look over. He does not need to. The land records already say what needed saying: 660 acres in his name, clear title, and a line in Nora's ledger under December 20-24 that has no flourish around it, just 2 words written in careful block print: note paid.